Story 1. Realistically, the federal government would continue funding those programs, increasing the national debt until the dispute was resolved in the courts, and likely the government would receive the money from the states. Story 2. It would be a disaster. This is what political polarization brings to society. Tends not to end well. Story 3. The federal government holds the keys to power. States not paying would be considered insurrection. The state leaders would likely be arrested by federal officers. It would be similar to California declaring itself independent from the United States. Story 4. People in conservative states will find out how many of their neighbors who criticize public assistance programs actually use those exact programs. Story 5. Many people in places like Owsley County in Kentucky, which voted almost 90% for Donald Trump, would starve since almost half of the population there is on food stamps paid for by the taxes that blue states send to the federal government. Story 6. Here is why this cannot work with the mechanics of how federal taxes are currently collected. The majority of federal taxes being discussed come from payroll checks, millions of payroll withholdings every payday from everyday people. These taxes are collected by businesses and submitted directly to the federal government week after week. Individuals and businesses make estimated tax payments to the Internal Revenue Service throughout the year and, at year-end, reconcile all withholdings and estimates with their tax returns. The state is never involved. It would take a mass individual protest at a grassroots level to reduce the funds sent to the federal government. However, if every California taxpayer changed their federal withholding to zero, they would owe taxes when they file their tax returns and also face penalties for underwithholding. The Internal Revenue Service is aware of this and acts to ensure a steady stream of income. Governor Newsom understands this and is likely not prepared to pay all the penalties individuals and businesses would incur. The idea feels appealing, but ultimately, it is the everyday person who would bear the financial risk under the current structure. Story 7. If the blue states stopped paying federal taxes, the federal government would not notice. Your employee pays your federal income tax to the Franchise Tax Board, which forwards the information on what was paid to the Internal Revenue Service. None of the states, even the blue ones, have the chance to handle that. Individual filers, meaning everyone, would be held accountable for back taxes that were not paid. Unless they completely believe in the cause, this would turn a large portion of the population against them. If you can somehow ignore the fact that this is impossible, and in this circumstance pretend it would not start a war, the federal government would isolate the West Coast shoreline, remove all federal funding, and work to overthrow or infiltrate top officials, as the Central Intelligence Agency has been doing for the last 60 years in South America and the Middle East. This will literally never happen, no matter what Gavin might have once thought. Story 8. States do not pay federal taxes. Individuals do. If you stop paying federal taxes, the federal government will sue you and take the tax money that you owe. Story 9. Somebody tell me which states collect federal taxes that they could withhold. My federal tax return goes to the Internal Revenue Service. My state, Maryland, does not receive federal tax payments, so how could they be withheld by the state? Does the state itself pay federal income taxes? This is news to me. I keep seeing this idea here and elsewhere, but no one can explain how it could happen because it cannot. Story 10. States do not pay taxes. Companies and employees pay taxes. Customers pay sales tax on their purchases. People in red states who are on government programs would be unaffected. Any revenue lost to those programs from corporations that refuse to pay taxes would not matter because the government is constantly spending money it does not have. You can read more about this by searching for the national deficit. In the long term, this could cause serious economic issues, but it likely would not last long. The Internal Revenue Service, under any administration, would be expanded and use its existing legal powers to prosecute these corporate uprisings. The average worker who is employed at one of these companies would not receive tax documents because taxes are not being paid. However, that individual still owes debt to the government and will face the corresponding impact on their credit rating that unpaid government debt tends to carry. Story 11. I see this sentiment all the time and I support the disruption something like this would cause. However, the states do not receive federal taxes and then send that money to the government. We all individually file our federal taxes directly to the government, just like we do for the states. It would have to be literally everyone in a given state collectively deciding not to file federal taxes by exempting themselves on their returns and at their jobs. Story 12. People need to understand it is not a red state, blue state divide. It is urban versus rural. The divides are not along state lines, and thinking of it that way is foolish. Story 13. Don't hate me, I'm liberal, but this does not end how many people seem to think it ends. Money in capitalism is not equal to use value. This would just force a renegotiation on trade rates. Since all 12 food-producing states, which produce more food than they consume, are red, and you need food more urgently than you need, say, capital investments, software, or advanced machinery, things blue states produce more of, I think we would see some wealth redistribution. International trade can offset this somewhat, but food is largely perishable. So the further you ship it, the more problematic it becomes. Also, ship is a key word here since the borders are federal. The states could maybe seize their ports, but you would not get trains or trucks across the borders if you anger the federal government. Story 14. States, except in the limited capacity of the employer of state employees, do not pay federal income taxes. Employers and employees pay taxes directly to the federal government. Some seem to think that Sacramento sends a huge check to Washington, D.C. regularly. That is not how this works. Story 15. States do not pay taxes. Taxpayers do. Are you asking what would happen if wealthy people in Democratic-leaning states stopped paying taxes? The Internal Revenue Service would arrest them and garnish their bank accounts. What if they could not collect the taxes? The federal government could not make payroll or distribute benefits. The first to be affected would be federal workers, low-income individuals, and the elderly in every state, regardless of political affiliation. Story 16. Neither side wins. As much as the MAGA movement and the liberal groups hate to admit it, the red states and the blue states need each other. We are one country, and we need to remain united for mutual benefit. Story 17. States do not pay federal taxes. Individual citizens do. If you live in a blue state and stop paying federal taxes, even if your state governor has told you to do so, the federal government will come after you, not the state. Even if blue states stopped paying into the United States government, the effect would be less drastic than many people think. The federal government currently runs a financial deficit. That deficit would increase by the net contribution of those blue states. The economy would start sliding backward faster, but red states would not collapse, nor would children suddenly go hungry, as some claim. Story 18. The federal government will face a significant legal battle over tax dollars as political polarization increases dramatically. Story 19. I like the idea of everyone stopping paying federal taxes. So let's find out. Starve out the grifters. Story 20. First, not all Republican-leaning states take more than they contribute. Some Republican-leaning states contribute more dollars than some Democratic-leaning states. Second, some Republican-leaning states contribute to the gross domestic product in ways other than raw dollars. The whole idea of Republican-leaning state versus Democratic-leaning state is propaganda designed to keep the citizenry fighting among itself. Story 21. For what it is worth, the numbers are distorted for various reasons, none of which are nefarious or intentional. It is not as straightforward as many imagine. This is a very truncated and simplified version. High-income earners in blue states like California, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and others accumulate large federal tax payments while working. However, many of those higher-income individuals retire in red states. Residents of New England often move to Florida or the Carolinas, while those on the West Coast frequently relocate to Arizona, among other places. As a result, the federal government sends substantial entitlement payments to these retirees, who originally earned their benefits in blue states but now live in red states. This creates the impression that blue states contribute more in federal taxes relative to the benefits they receive. However, this is primarily a function of migration rather than actual contribution disparities. If everyone retired in California instead of Florida, South Carolina, Arizona, and other states, it would appear that California receives the most benefits compared to its federal tax contributions. This migration is a key factor causing significant distortions in the perceived state contribution levels. Story 22. For the first time in their lives, they would be correct about their lives being negatively affected because of liberals. Story 23. Do states pay the taxes? Or is it the individuals and businesses? It does not seem possible for a state to stop paying federal taxes. Story 24. They would just take on more debt and pretend Republicans have always advocated for expanding the debt to fund welfare programs. Story 25. I think it is important to remember that all of our communities are diverse. The concept of red states and blue states is a polarized construction. Story 26. Actually, Trump is doing that right now. If he cuts Medicaid and the Federal Emergency Management Agency back in Republican states like he wants, they are the biggest recipients of these programs. I think California could probably take care of itself, but there are a few other Democratic states that cannot. I know of 2 Republican states, West Virginia and Kentucky, where over 50% of their state's revenue comes from federal government sources. They can cut taxes because the federal government will take up the slack. I see the Republican states rebelling against MAGAville first. Trump has already told Kansas to deal with their tornado damage. Eastern North Carolina has hurricane damage. Wait until the first hurricane hits Mississippi or Florida hard. Let's see how much he ignores them. Story 27. More cuts to essential services. More taxes on people who cannot afford them. Increased class tensions met with greater authoritarianism. Essentially what is already happening, but at a faster pace. Story 28. The red states would instantly stop sending all the energy and food they produce to the blue states. The residents of the blue states would be shivering in the cold, sweltering in the heat, and starving because store shelves would be empty. Story 29. It would depend on how it was done. If it was done with the agreement of the federal government, for example, a law was passed to stop collecting federal taxes from states, then it would probably slowly destroy the United States federal government. It would not just be a shortfall in terms of funds transferred to certain states, but a shortfall in all federal spending. The role of the federal government itself would have to be radically rethought, probably through some major constitutional change. This would be a major disaster for the United States. If it was done without agreement from the federal government, then that previous scenario would look like the more favorable option. The federal government being unable to impose tax collection, one of the basic powers of a government, on the states would be the biggest constitutional crisis since the Civil War. It is hard to see that ending in anything other than either war or the disintegration of the United States. Story 30. New rule. 4 years to balance your budget. And if you do not, you lose 1 senator. No state should have to pay for another. Repeat every 4 years. Story 31. The federal government intervenes, arrests several officials in Democratic state governments, seizes the funds, and Republican states express approval. Story 32. There are no red states and blue states. Cities are blue, rural areas are red, and suburbs are purple. Story 33. Guys, it would definitely be a disaster. This is what political polarization brings to a society. Tends not to end well. Story 34. We need to treat failing states like businesses and sell them off if they are a burden on the United States of America. Story 35. Economic collapse and many people dying needlessly due to lack of food, water, and basic necessities. Story 36. I was watching a video on West Virginia, and the number of people who subsist on receiving disability payments is astounding. I assume these are disability payments. Story 37. They would increase the price of the food they grow and stop honoring the price controls on some foods. They would also increase the cost of lumber, coal, and oil. Story 38. The states do not pay taxes. Individual taxpayers and employers do. Nothing would happen to the red states or their employers. The blue state employers would start feeling the impact very quickly, as would the taxpayers, though not as fast. The federal government takes withholding taxes extremely seriously. Any employer that does not account for them will be liable, and if they do account but do not remit on schedule, the Internal Revenue Service will respond immediately by freezing accounts and visiting their offices. Story 39. The red states would be hurting. To flip this around, what if in return the red states said, "We will no longer ship food to blue states. California is a big producer of food, but when you consider most cattle and chicken products come from red states, things would get interesting. Story 40. The same as if the blue states seceded, the red states would become a third world country. See Better Off Without Them by Chuck Thompson. Story 41. This line of questioning, while fun, is pointless and only further divides America into red and blue. Here are some better questions. Why are our tax dollars being used to harm poor people when there are plastics and chemicals that are toxic in our water? Why are we giving tax breaks to the very rich when ultimately that will hurt everyone, including the rich? Why have we become accustomed to corruption when we should be holding leaders of both parties accountable? Why are we ignoring the fact that more than 60 years of failed leadership has gotten us to this point? Why are we okay with our children's lives being worse than ours? The list goes on, but asking what if we just hurt the other side is reductionist and counterproductive. Story 42. Please, we are running out of popcorn here in Europe. Why deport all the people that work in cornfields? Is there going to be a second season of this comedy? Best comedy this year, 10 out of 10 would watch again. Story 43. They would take on more debt. However, blue states would obviously be in violation of the law, and there would probably be a full-scale civil war if every blue state stopped paying. Story 44. Generally speaking, the states that typically vote for the Republican Party would suffer, and the states that typically vote for the Democratic Party would have an abundance they could hoard, similar to billionaires. Story 45. It would give the red states exactly what they wanted, state autonomy. If blue states can stop paying federal taxes, so can red states. That will push the snowball downhill. I firmly believe that the reason Republicans are weakening the federal government is to force blue states to protect themselves from it, giving red states a precedent for doing the same later. My conspiratorial view is that we may eventually see a version 2 of Jim Crow, but with stronger state protection against the federal government. Story 46. It is worth reminding people that states are not perfectly homogeneous. Hurting a state because it leans heavily in one direction will still hurt many people with whom you may be ideologically aligned. Story 47. There will be chaos, and it is most likely to affect the red states. Many of them, especially the more rural ones, receive more funding from the federal government than they contribute. This includes areas such as infrastructure, education, healthcare, and disaster relief. If the blue states stopped contributing, the red states would feel the impact quickly. However, realistically, this situation would never succeed. The federal system would likely react strongly. Lawsuits would be filed, leading to a total constitutional crisis, and it would be very messy. Story 48. First, this hypothetical is the worst revenge fantasy ever. Many red states have vulnerable black populations who receive most of the government benefits, while being outvoted by white populations. Income inequality is significant. If you got what you want, you would be disadvantaging people who mostly vote for the Democratic Party. Second, red states would not do anything. The federal government would act as a completely separate entity without requiring anything from the red states in particular. Story 49. This is not actually possible, as most employees have their federal taxes withheld automatically before receiving their paychecks, and the employer pays them directly to the federal government. I believe states like California should either set up an escrow system so that individuals can claim zero exemptions and deposit what would be federal taxes to the state, which would guarantee their protection. Alternatively, the states should enact legislation requiring employers to collect federal taxes that would then be delivered to the federal government. In the current situation, this is not really possible. It is not that I am opposed to it. I was saying the same thing months ago. Take bold action now and let the courts decide later. Declare a state emergency, claim an invasion of foreign militants since there are proposals to bring in active duty military, which is unconstitutional without a national emergency. Story 50. Red, blue, it does not matter. You are so divided that you fail to realize that opting out of federal taxes is harmful to everyone and is an act of insurrection. Story 51. Reddit has a strong preference for anything liberal. However, realistically, Texas and Florida would be fine, while states like Mississippi, West Virginia, and Alabama would not. Story 52. I am reading all of the comments here and have one conclusion. Billionaires need to pay more in taxes. Story 53. Well, the Internal Revenue Service would start freezing bank accounts to collect taxes. The Department of Justice would be busy fast-tracking lawsuits. Inflation would rise, and the Department of the Treasury would begin printing more money. Many people would end up laid off as the economy declines. After 4 to 6 months, tax payments would resume. The federal government has the means to enforce the payment of federal taxes. If multiple states are involved, the Department of Justice and the Internal Revenue Service would initiate a rapid response and likely take reprisals against those states. This situation could also lead to armed conflict and even attempts at secession. These groups might be called the New Confederation of States, which is ironic. Story 54. The red states are net consumers of tax funds in nearly every way. The only useful thing we get from them is bodies for the armies and land and bodies for the corporate overlords to work into the ground. Story 55. States do not pay taxes. Individuals and businesses do. New York cannot divert federal tax dollars to its own coffers. The federal government provides money to the states in the form of grants and other funding. Honestly, the states that typically vote for the Democratic Party would probably be worse off, at least in the short run, because their federal funds would be cut off first. Story 56. What would happen to the blue states of the United States if the red states stopped supplying them with food and everyday necessities? Story 57. California is already threatening to do this because Donald Trump has indicated he wants to stop sending federal funds to the state. Think about this. California is practically a nation unto itself, with a gross domestic product to rival that of some countries. Not to mention they provide a significant percentage of America's food and fresh produce, along with the technological innovation from Silicon Valley. You can even include Hollywood in there. I don't care about the politics of it. This is not leadership. It seems civil war is almost inevitable if the people in Washington continue to stoke the flames of division and anger. I don't have another answer to your question. Story 58. The same thing that happens to the blue states would happen to the entire country. The entire nation would collapse, but if somehow it did not, you would be hurting the elderly, the poor, and the children of every state. Story 59. It wouldn't be nearly as bad as what would happen if the conservative states stopped giving the liberal states all the commodities they produce, like food and energy. I think many people don't understand that the United States functions like a mini empire, with the conservative states in the middle producing goods and the liberal states profiting from their sale, movement, or added value later. If the conservative and liberal states separated, some conservative states would become very wealthy as the national capital moved to St. Louis and the financial center shifted from New York to Dallas. The West Coast would still do well, as they have their own native industries, but the East Coast liberal areas would decline significantly. Story 60. It would be a disaster. I live in a poor welfare state and would love to see it happen because I am tired of the hypocrisy of people in my state who talk about welfare while they are indeed on welfare. Story 61. The amount of taxes collected has never stopped the federal government from spending. They continue to spend and likely use it as an excuse to increase spending. In turn, the printing of even more money will cause inflation, which will hurt both conservative and liberal states. Story 62. Since the vast majority of the payouts go to the red states, many of those states would see negative results. It is likely they would experience a spiral of worsening conditions as people leave those areas, causing the situation to deteriorate further. Story 63. We are about to find out that returning everything to the states and eliminating income taxes will force red states to fend for themselves, as they would have previously received federal assistance. Story 64. Isn't that moving power to the state where it belongs? Or did I miss that turn too? I am all for every state for itself. It would be a good time for many people to face reality. I have no issue going from the South to California. In case you need to check, Silicon Valley is not in Mississippi. Should we bring poor rednecks back? Make America white, racist, dumb, and poor? These people do not even know what the goal is. Again, it reminds me of South Park episodes that fall into the category tweak, like Underpants Gnomes. Story 65. If that happens, the question is what happens to all the states, as the nation would essentially be over. Would the military get involved against the states? I do not know. The question would not be some petty political, I am taking my ball and going home fantasy that people like to imagine will hurt the other side. Story 66. This federal government could potentially interpret it as sedition and use it as justification to use force to apprehend traitors. Story 67. It is not possible in our current system. Taxes do not go from people to their states to the federal government. They go directly from people to the federal government. The states do not have any opportunity to stop it, even if they wanted to. Story 68. Good things would happen, and the real benefactors of American society would be truly revealed. However, it would also be a national disaster, as red states are fueled by desperation. The majority of the United States would suffer greatly. Story 69. It depends on the state. Some would be completely affected by it, while others may be okay. For example, the Texas economy is the 8th largest in the world. This puts it slightly ahead of Australia, Canada, and Russia. Story 70. It would not go well. However, it would be particularly worse for states with a majority voting for the Republican Party, as a general statement. Most of these states receive more federal government funds than they contribute in taxes. Story 71. See the Kansas experiment on Wikipedia. Basically, those states would collapse within 4 years due to mounting debt, lack of income from taxes, and a lack of jobs and industry generating revenue for the state through purchases. Companies would move out of the states as viable employment would disappear, and it would be cheaper to move production back to states with stronger economies. Within 5 years, those states would be in so much debt that they would all have to declare bankruptcy. Story 72. The states with conservative policies are often criticized for welfare dependency, which may potentially lead to social unrest if welfare support is reduced. Story 73. You cannot simply stop paying taxes. They are deducted from your paycheck by your employer, who does not care if you want to pay them or not. The only tax you must pay yourself is a state property tax. If you do not pay it, you will receive a lien on your property. Eventually, the state will take ownership of your property and sell it to recover the unpaid taxes. Story 74. There was a scenario mentioned on Reddit a few years ago that I have been unable to find again. The idea was that the blue states, at a time when such a vote is possible, repeal federal tax and replace it with another tax system open to states participating in a state compact. Membership would be available for states that ratify certain amendments. The plan includes changing the Second Amendment, overturning Citizens United, eliminating the Electoral College, reinstating the Fairness Doctrine, adopting proportional representation, redistricting, abolishing remaining slavery for convicts, reforming the Supreme Court, and granting statehood to remaining territories. States outside the compact would receive no financial help from the compact. I have no idea whether any of this would be feasible. Story 75. These new countries would adapt accordingly because their progress is not solely due to a federal government or individual state governments. Comparative advantage in trade would remain true, as it already exists between states. The free movement of labor would continue to be beneficial, even if these countries start imposing immigration policies against each other. Blue states cannot produce everything, and neither can red states. With the kind of division being discussed, local protectionism, trade wars, and immigration restrictions would likely increase, worsening the situation. In such a case, the East and West Coasts might become separate entities. The Great Lakes states could pursue their own path or join Canada, and the central region of the country would continue to produce substantial agricultural products and focus heavily on fuel production. There is strong reason to believe that fracturing this large free trade zone, known as the United States of America, would lead to negative outcomes for everyone. The benefits of free movement and comparative advantage within this zone are significant. Such a division would likely be immature, driven by hostility, and would undermine free trade and labor mobility. The arguments supporting trade wars are misguided, and this applies to smaller nations as well. Story 76. Revolution. Civil War. That is what happened the last 2 times groups of states refused to pay taxes. Story 77. At that point, the states would be in soft succession. It would eventually end with the federal government's collapse, and you would likely see a civil war without end. Story 78. States do not pay taxes. Individuals do. If states encouraged people to stop paying their taxes, compliance with state tax laws would be low. However, this would be largely ineffective because employers deduct most or all of the taxes individuals owe from their paychecks. For those who try to stop paying taxes, the federal government would impose fines. If the fines are not paid, the government would garnish wages through employers and banks, which it regulates. Story 79. Let us be very clear that refusing to pay federal taxes was a significant factor at the beginning of the Civil War. Story 80. States cannot choose not to pay taxes. Individuals and states can choose not to pay, and the federal government can use its police power to collect those taxes from people who do not pay. Story 81. States do not pay taxes. The people and businesses in those states pay taxes. State governments have no real way to interpose themselves between taxpayers and the federal government. However, if there were a way, federal reactions could include ceasing all federal payments to people living in those states, cutting water and electrical transfers from outside states, closing post offices, shutting down harbors, airports, and rail traffic, and keeping foreign travelers out. State economies are interdependent and rely on a functioning federal government to keep them going. Story 82. The problem is that states do not pay federal taxes. People do. Federal taxes are deducted directly from your paycheck. Unless everyone instructs their employer to withhold zero federal taxes from their paychecks, everyone will continue to pay federal taxes in states that traditionally support the Democratic Party. Story 83. Goodbye welfare programs and the majority of the federal agencies and departments the federal government has been using to undermine constitutional state rights. Do it. The less money the federal government has, the better. It's just being laundered through the accounting of bloated budgets and then funneled off to themselves and their biggest corporate donors anyway, so that would stop too. They'd have to do actual budgets and then actually account for where the money was going. The days of pretending the National Aeronautics and Space Administration spent $23 million designing a space toilet would be over. Red State resident here. I support this plan wholeheartedly. Edit. By the way, we'd be fine because, in case you were unaware, state income taxes also exist. Each state should be self-sustaining from the revenue generated from income earners in their state, not be dependent on federal subsidies. I would love if the federal government started defaulting on the payments they send us because it would lead to a showdown between the states and the federal government that's long overdue. The federal government's core motivation for starting these subsidies in the first place was to leverage them to exert control over what the states are doing. It would essentially be a debt recovery case like, hey, the federal government isn't paying their annual bill. It accounts for 2% of our annual budget. We can't cover those losses with our current revenue. So in order to recover those funds, our state taxpayers are going to get a withholding on the federal taxes in perpetuity, and moving forward we'll raise our state tax to cover the loss and our taxpayers will pay us directly. Believe me, red states would love to be given a justified reason to snatch that carrot away from the federal government, because what we hate the most is the fact that career Washington, D.C. politicians have any ability to dictate anything that goes on in our lives. Literally, we dream about getting the federal government's nosy, bossy control out of our business. Blue states would be making red states' dreams come true by forcing the federal government back to their original constitutional powers because they can't afford to be anything else. As a hypothetical, say the federal government decides to withhold federal subsidies from all states that legalized marijuana. This would be unconstitutional because the voters in those states voted to make it legal within their state. That's the key right there. Taxpayers in states that haven't legalized are not affected by those laws. Our federal taxes aren't being used to subsidize that state's choices. I am assuming the origin of your post is Gavin Newsom's posturing about California not paying federal taxes. That's just political theater because California has no legal standing to challenge federal taxes. Why? Because illegal immigrants do cost federal taxpayers in every state, and the cost is significant. Because of this, it would be entirely justifiable and legal for former President Donald Trump to cut off federal subsidies to every state not complying. Summary of how red state voters would feel, faced with tears of joy. Story 84. Blue states do not pay federal taxes. Companies and residents do. Most companies, especially those doing business in multiple states, and many residents, particularly those with higher incomes and income from businesses or stock, and blue states will continue to pay federal taxes. Story 85. Please do not fan the flames. Yes, Republican states get a lot of aid from Democratic states, and Democratic states get resources and manufacturing from Republican states. That is why we are Americans, to be there for each other even if we cannot see it yet. We should be demanding more aid for them and offering more compassion without judgment. Story 86. Basically, you would have hub cities of Democratic. Republican states would continue to have control over the whole state, while Democratic states with heavy Republican areas like California would break off instantly. States are Democratic because a small area contains most of the most dedicated voters. These Democratic cities would struggle basically and have minimal resources. Story 87. It is not as simple as a red states versus blue states issue. Studies that state red states are receivers of federal aid intentionally exclude the cost of federal employees and grants. According to unbiased sources, the answer depends on the state. Story 88. While some red states like Texas could financially support themselves, most would find themselves bankrupt without blue states subsidizing the rest of the country. Granted, some blue states would also be in financial trouble, such as New Mexico. Red states have blue cities, and blue states have red rural areas. Story 89. Then everyone should stop paying taxes. The officials in the federal government are not responsible enough with money. Story 90. The Republican-controlled states would invade the Democratic-controlled states and start a civil war. Far-right Republicans have been fantasizing about a do-over for the Civil War basically non-stop since conservative discourse was taken over by 24-hour cable television and amplitude modulation radio. Story 91. Hopefully they will all come to their senses and stop supporting racist fascist individuals. However, I doubt that. They will cry foul and blame it on Joseph Biden and the Democratic Party. Story 92. No states pay very little in only indirect federal taxes. Unless you mean something like the people of a certain state, which would be very difficult to organize, and most is withheld from paychecks anyway. If some percentage of people from a state decided to try to do that, standard enforcement would apply, and their assets would be seized quickly. Story 93. The premise is absurd. States do not pay federal taxes. Individuals do. If individuals stop paying federal taxes, they will suffer. Story 94. You would be making the lives of many black and brown people even worse than they already are. Please look up demographics of red states before assuming they are all uneducated. Story 95. Taxes are not collected at the state level. Individual citizens and companies file with and directly pay the federal government. Therefore, the premise itself is unworkable. Story 96. They would also stop paying taxes and watch the government collapse, which was already going to happen even if they continued paying. They could secede if they wanted to stay together. Red states are contiguous, aside from Alaska, though they would have a few enclaves of blue, such as Colorado. A federal government with no income would not put up a fight. In retrospect, the real question is whether they would use the United States military to enforce tax payments from blue states. Story 97. If blue states could get away with it without federal intervention, it would be a hit to red states and cause difficulties. If red states did the same, small red rural states would probably have to make deals with richer red states or merge with them to survive. Several warnings for red states. 1. Agricultural, California, Central Valley, and Mexico. Blue states build strong relationships with allied countries. Red states do not. Blue states would pick off a few vulnerable red states in the Midwest and merge. Currently, red states have little to no international support and, given their arrogance, would have to fend off intruders mostly with firearms. Canada, Mexico, and blue states would develop a strong bond for sharing goods and services. The rest of the world would have little to do with racist, arrogant red states. The first 5 years would be tough for everyone in North America, but in the end, blue states would rebuild with allied support while red states would falter due to their politics, making the rich richer and the poor poorer. That is when serious conflicts would begin for them. Story 98. Instead of the United States of America taking over Canada, Canada should invite the blue states to join their country and let the red states fester in the mess of their own making. Story 99. States do not pay federal tax. It goes directly from your employer to the United States Treasury. If you are self-employed, you pay the Treasury every quarter. Story 100. As God and our founders intended. Remember, income redistribution among the states was not legal when the Constitution was ratified and required the 16th Amendment. The Republican welfare state was not what the people who founded our country had in mind. Story 101. About 10 years of turbulence, but the red states would learn their place. Blue states funding red states is one thing when we do not have fascists running the country, but that is exactly what we have. Blue states should reject their funds so that corrupt corporations lose their power. Story 102. They will discover precisely how much blue states contribute compared to their fellow red constituents. They may increase the national debt significantly before collapsing due to poor management. Story 103. One can only dream. That is called secession and is virtually impossible to accomplish. Those states would become their own countries. Story 104. This is a false argument. States do not pay federal taxes. Their citizens do. So if all California taxpayers united into one block and agreed to boycott, they would each be individually charged with tax evasion, and their lives would be ruined. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.